All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the third in a series of 2023 Farm to School 101 webinars that we are conducting for all of you, and hopefully we'll be giving you some support about hot topics in farm to school. We knew that this one was going to be a really popular one. So today we're going to be talking about buying local produce, and we have some excellent guest speakers who can share a little bit of background and really answer your questions about what you want to know about how you can connect with some local produce farmers in Minnesota, especially if you're an MDA Farm to School grantee. We're excited to support you in your local purchasing endeavors. And we won't take the time to have everybody introduce yourselves verbally, but if all the attendees would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, we'd love to see who's here. So you could share your name, your location, and your role in Farm to School. And while you're doing that, we'll have our presenters introduce ourselves so that you know who's going to be talking to you today. So my name is Erin McKee, and I'm the Community Food Systems Program Director at IATP, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We do a lot of work on farm to school and farm to early care, and I'm excited to connect with all of you today. And I'll pass it over to Kate.
Hi everyone, I'm Kate Seybold. I work at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture as the Regional Marketing Specialist. And so a big and fun part of my job is getting to work with all of you to support farm to school efforts. And I also support our farm to school grant, which many of you are recipients for. So really looking forward to today and sharing some hopefully helpful information for you around buying local produce. I will pass it to Annalisa.
Great, thanks, Kate. My name is Annalisa Hultberg. Thanks for having me. I'm a regional extension educator in food safety at the University of Minnesota. So I work around the state, top to bottom, all around with fruit and vegetable farmers on-farm food safety, good agricultural practices, and kind of post-harvest handling and washing of fruits and vegetables. So that's me. I'll pass it to Rae.
Hi, I'm Rae Rusnak, and I own and operate L&R Poultry and Produce. I'm in Goodhue County, Minnesota, near Kenyon, and I've been working with farm to school programs since about 2007, 2008. And I've worked with schools as big as Minneapolis and as small as Goodhue, which has K through 12 in one building. So I enjoy it, and I'm hoping I can share with you some ways to get some of us farmers out of the field, hiding out of the corn, and share with you how to meet farmers, and also a little bit about how to best practices in communication, building relationships with farmers. Thank you.
And then Erica, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Erica Olson, and I work for Wayzata Public Schools. I am the nutrition coordinator here, and one of my big responsibilities is to roll out the Farm to School grant here. And so this is their first year doing the grant, and so we're looking forward to getting into it.
Great, thank you. And I'll just let all of you know, so today's webinar is taking the place of our usual office hours, which are more interactive and really guided by the attendees. But today, just for scheduling reasons, we're gonna share information with you in a more presenter way, but we will have time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions along the way as our presenters are sharing, please share those in the chat, and then I'll be copying those down, and we will have time at the end where we will ask the presenters to respond to those as well. But now I will pass it over to Kate to kick off our presentation here.
Thanks, Erin. So as we mentioned, the topic of today is buying fresh local produce. So we're just going to share some kind of strategies and best practices for all of you as you think about connecting with produce farmers and making plans for the local produce that you're going to be buying. And then Annalisa is going to share some information about food safety when we're thinking and talking about buying local produce. And then you'll get to hear from Rae and Erica as kind of, the perspectives from both farmers and schools on how to build, great long-lasting relationships working together around local produce. And then, as Erin mentioned, we'll have time to kind of hopefully get to some of your questions at the end. So one of the reasons we picked today's topic of produce is that we know that many of you are buying local produce as part of your farm to school program. And just wanted to share this fun statistic. IATP and University of Minnesota Extension recently put out a grant evaluating MDA's farm to school grant program for one of our previous years. And so this was based on that report. It looks like from our past farm to school grant cycles, about 1/3 of farm to school funding that we're awarding to schools is being spent on local produce. So it's a big part of the farm to school scene here in Minnesota, and we want to make sure that you have the tools and resources to be successful at buying local produce and working with Minnesota's produce farmers. So this is, I apologize, it's a little blurry from my snippet tool, but I thought this was interesting. This is also from that report I mentioned, and just shows some of the most popular fresh produce items that schools are buying for farm to school in Minnesota right now. Apples are clearly our leader far and away, and that makes sense. We're in a big apple state here, and there's wonderful events like the Great Lakes Apple Crunch to promote apples. But then, some of the other popular items, we're seeing a lot of carrots, radishes, potatoes. I think, those are great storage items to be serving here in Minnesota, because depending on the farm you work with, you may be able to buy those, well into the winter, sometimes even spring, and they just store well, and they're really versatile on the menu. And we also see a lot of romaine being purchased, which is exciting, and most likely ending up on beautiful salad bars. But then also you just see the really wonderful variety of produce that Minnesota producers are growing and helping to get into our school meals. So just wanted to share that as kind of a fun fact, and perhaps a little bit of inspiration for you as you think about what local produce items you want to be focusing on. Seasonality is, of course, an important piece to think about here in Minnesota as you're buying local produce. And just wanted to highlight this as a handy little cheat reference. Minnesota Grown has this graphic. It's available on the Minnesota Grown website. We can send it out afterwards, but I think it just provides a nice visual kind of showing Minnesota's growing season and the average season and the peak average season for a variety of different produce items. Of course, it's going to vary year to year based on the growing season. And I would say the farmers you're working with are going to be, have the best perspective on when certain things will be ready based on what they're seeing out in their fields, if they have hoop houses or, greenhouses that they're working with that may be able to extend their season. So it varies, but this is a helpful little resource if you're ever kind of wondering oh, when are we, expecting peppers? This can be a kind of quick go-to guide. And then, of course, there's the kind of seasonality of the school year for you to be thinking about as well. And so just wanted to show this graphic to kind of highlight a few things, which is that, I think we get a lot of questions here in Minnesota, like, how do you do farm to school with your growing season? But the reality is that there's tons of great Minnesota grown and raised foods to be buying all school year long. And while certainly I think the bulk of produce is being purchased and served in those fall months, there are items that can be purchased throughout the school year. And then I also wanted to just highlight, this time of year, end of winter, early spring is a really fantastic time to be connecting with farmers, to get quotes and talk about what they have to offer and what they're growing. And so I know many of you have already been doing that, and did that in preparation for your farm to school grants. But if you haven't yet, there's still time, and this is a great time to kind of reach out and start making those connections with farmers. So there's still time if you're not there yet, but this, again, hopefully this webinar is coming at a helpful time to give you some resources to start doing that. And then I really just want to emphasize, I think that as you're thinking about farm to school, that it's really important to approach it as a partnership and think about how the work you're putting in now is going to be the foundation for building a relationship. In any good partnership, both parties are contributing information and perspective and then working together to figure out a plan. And I think that's the best way to approach how you think about sourcing local produce. And so some of the things we're going to be talking about today is, going into conversations with farmers, do your homework and kind of think about what you want first and what you might need, or, questions you have. I encourage you to write it down so that after that conversation with a farmer, you can, send in an email, and then have that conversation and ask questions and hear, what the farmer is looking for or what they have to offer. And then that's where you can kind of work collaboratively to adjust plans and figure out something that's going to work great for both parties. And then I think, just frequent communication is really important. And so keep in touch. Once you have your plans placed, be in touch with the farmer throughout the growing season to hear how things are going, adjust your plans again if needed. At the end of the season, do a debrief and just ask, how did the season go for you? What can we do differently next year? And just continue to invest in that relationship. And the picture that you see here on the screen is one from when I worked at Minneapolis. And I don't usually put pictures of myself in a webinar, but I put it to show the other people in the picture, which is I'm talking to a produce farmer, Ben Doherty from Open Hands Farm, and then Mark Augustine was the executive chef at Minneapolis Public Schools at the time. And I think it's really important to also think about who you're bringing into that conversation as you're building these relationships, and approaching it as a team effort and thinking about, who are your other staff that you want to be bringing into this work, so that it's not, just you, and that you're bringing in different perspectives that will be helpful down the line as you're working with this produce and trying to grow your program. And really think of it as a collaborative effort. And while this picture is showing us, talking in person, which I think is really valuable, there will be, many phone calls and emails had, and there's many different ways to communicate, but all of them I think are really important for building out that relationship and keeping in touch. So the piece about doing your homework is, documenting what you want or what you're looking for when you're buying local produce. And, this could be also considered like writing your produce specs or specifications. And I think sometimes that can feel like a daunting task, but it's really just writing down what you're looking for and kind of thinking through the process and what you want to get out of it. And so I think some key questions for you to ask yourself is, what are the produce items that you're looking for? How much do you need? And how often would you be looking for that, and when? So there's certain produce items that have a very finite growing season here in Minnesota, but there's also ones that have longer. And so thinking about when you'd be ideally bringing in that product will be helpful for when you talk to the farmer. And then think about how you're going to be using it, because I think that will help you answer the next question around like what size or shape or quality of produce you might be needing. So for instance, if you're bringing in, carrots to make carrot sticks, you might want the carrot to be a certain length. Or if you're bringing in butternut squash and you know that you're just going to be dicing it up, you may be able to buy a really big butternut squash, which, I'll just mention Farmer Rae here on the line can grow some of the biggest butternut squash I've ever seen. Other schools though may want smaller butternut squash based on what equipment you have. So just thinking about how you're using it, what tools and resources and staff capacity you have, and making note of what you need kind of out of the produce that you're looking to buy. And then think about how you want to receive it. So do you want it washed? How should it be packed? And for all of these questions, I'm thinking about like, how much flexibility do you have? Do you really need to make sure you're getting something at a certain time, or based on the growing season, can you, be flexible and adjust your menu? Maybe, size doesn't really matter and you know that you'll probably be able to work with anything. that's great, but just kind of thinking through that level of flexibility of where you're at. And I'll also say that if you're thinking about these questions and you don't know the answers to them, that's okay. And I think that helps you then think about what are the questions to ask the farmer that you're working with. And again, maybe just if you don't have an answer, it means that you do have a higher level of flexibility for some of this. And that's a great thing to be able to tell a produce farmer then. If you are answering those questions and do want to write it down, this is one approach that you could take. So Minneapolis Public Schools goes through and kind of lists out produce item by produce item, the product description and how it's going to be used. So you see here, like for beets, it doesn't need to be long, but they know it's going to be diced and roasted, and they can take large sizes and some misshape is okay. And then they walk through and they explain how it should be washed or packed, and then how much they're looking for. So you could go through this for each of the produce items you're looking for, and then you have it in writing, and it's really handy for you to be able to share with a farmer as reference, and for your own staff to be able to go back and look at. These are a few more examples here. So kind of going back to the carrot example I shared, if you're needing it to be a certain length or certain diameter and size, you could note that. And some cosmetic defects might be okay. For melons, maybe you want at least a certain size to be able to get the yield out of it that you want. So you could note minimum weight of 3 pounds. Butternut squash, the bigger the better, maybe how you feel, or maybe you want a certain size. And then you can note things around quality, like minimal soft spots and decay. Again, I think this is a pretty detailed example. And if you're, kind of starting out with farm to school purchases, you may not be ready to write this level of detail for everything, but this could be something that you work towards over time as you learn more and kind of go through those steps of working with your partner farms. But again, it's a nice reference for you to have to kind of set expectations for yourself and for the farmers you're working with. Another option taken from the Food for Farms toolkit is, rather than going item by item for some of those quality pieces, you could just kind of write out some of your overall expectations. So, here it's noting that fresh fruits and vegetables should be cool to the touch when it's received, of reasonably uniform color, free from objectionable matter, and it should be, free from extraneous, stem ends or rots, etc. So this is another example, and this toolkit is available online. We'll send it out afterwards, and you could just pull this language. I know Wasabi East uses this in their RFP. And both of these examples from Minneapolis and this one are used in an RFP, but I think even if you're just doing a micro purchase or you're collecting, quotes from a couple farms, you can still be documenting this just to have, again, to have it documented in writing, just to be able to have really clear communication with everyone involved. So once you've kind of thought through that on your end, then I think you can go to the produce farms that you're looking to work with. And here's some things that you can ask them, how much of a product are you able to supply? And maybe first, just what are all the different products you can supply? Because they may be growing something that you hadn't considered. And then asking about availability. What varieties do they grow? Or what size do they typically have for certain items? Delivery, do they have a minimum order size for delivery? Or is there a maximum number of locations that they can deliver to? That might be something to think about if you are hoping to have a farmer deliver to several locations. And then you can ask about food safety, which Annalisa is going to be sharing about. And then of course, you're going to want to get pricing information. Really quickly, a few kind of things to think about in these conversations. I think thinking about sizing and quality, you see here on the left, this delicata squash is like very nicely uniform, similar colors, similar size, versus, here on the picture on the right, you see beautiful peppers, but they're different, kind of shapes and sizes and colors. And you may look at that and say, yep, that's great. We can, we could take all of that. Or maybe, you'd say we could, but we'd want to know that in advance because that might change, how we plan to use it. So just kind of, again, thinking through what you're expecting versus what the farmer might be thinking about, so that you can then talk through that together. You may also want to talk about, if you want produce items trimmed or bunched. So the picture on the left, you're seeing beets, they have the greens on them, they have got the rubber band around it. You may want beets coming in to look more like the picture on the right, where the stems are taken off, so they're trimmed. Maybe you don't want them bunched. So those would be kind of topics to think about for like carrots, radishes, beets, kohlrabi, herbs. If you're working with a farmer that maybe typically sells retail or at the farmer's market, they may be used to not trimming and bunching their things. And so you could just note that as something that you'd be interested in having for your products. And then washing. This is a very handy little chart from Annalisa and the University of Minnesota Extension. Just thinking about what products should or are typically being washed by a farm versus aren't. You should be washing all the produce when it comes to you. And so then for some things, you may not want the farmer to wash in advance. So for instance, tomatoes, once they're washed, their shelf life is going to become much shorter. And so as long as those tomatoes are like free of soil, that may be better for bringing in, so that it can store longer than in your kitchens before you're using it. Meanwhile, for things like carrots, you're definitely going to probably not want a lot of soil coming in on those carrots. And so those could be washed in advance. And then for some things, it might be a kind of like sometimes status where you could talk with the farmer. Green beans, cucumbers, sometimes those can come out of the field relatively clean. Or if it recently rained and soil's splashing up on them, you might want them washed or at least wiped clear. So you can kind of use this chart as a starting point, but then I think it would just be a conversation with the farmer on what they typically do and what you're hoping to receive. And then packing. So, farmers will be harvesting into big totes, and then, for a farmer's market, they may be going into these like small clamshell containers, but maybe you want them in big, big containers rather than those small containers. So there's a lot of different types of packaging to think about, and farmers will probably have a preferred option for you, but just so you're kind of aware of what's out there, these white boxes are wax boxes, and they should be coming to you clean, new, and they come in a variety of sizes. Sometimes carrots might be coming in like plastic bags. You've got the clamshell containers here on the bottom that are really small. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there's like big watermelon bins. So if you are a larger school and you're bringing in a lot of stuff, maybe you want your watermelons to just come in one of those big containers where you can store it rather than being put into smaller boxes. And then maybe you want to ask if the farm's able to just deliver it in a reusable container that you're able to return to them. I know some farms are interested in that. It's a great way to reduce waste. So just different options to consider. Again, if you don't know, what you want, I think that's where you can just ask the farmer what they typically offer, and go from there as a starting point. So that was a whole lot of different tidbits, but hopefully some helpful things for you to think about kind of as you're prepping for conversations with farmers or thinking about what questions you want to ask them. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Annalisa now to share a little bit more about food safety specifically when talking with produce farms.
Great, thanks, Kate. You can advance to the next slide. So, oh,
I remember you're going to share your screen.
yeah, but I put them in there now.
Oh, you did?
Uh-huh. You might have to reshare because maybe it's shared before.
Oh, that could be. Okay, hold on.
We were having some tech issues at the beginning.
No? Okay, wait. 1 second.
And I'll just remind people that if you have any burning questions, I feel like Kate shared a lot of great information and maybe you're feeling overwhelmed. If you have any questions you want us to try to get to at the end, feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll be keeping a little record of those to get back to once we have the Q&A portion of our presentation at the end here.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect. So GAPs, good agricultural practices, are the practices that farmers use on their farm while they're growing, harvesting, washing, packing, holding, transporting those fresh fruits and vegetables for use. So to be clear, these are voluntary science-based best practices that they use regardless of the buyer. But, you know, as I've been working with growers over the past many years here, we really talk about using extra special care when we're growing fruits and vegetables that might be consumed raw and by children, elderly, kind of immune compromised populations that if they did get pathogenic organisms via those fresh fruits and vegetables, they might be even more at risk for illness. But they do use them really with all fruit and vegetable production. So the next slide. So this is the slide that I would show farmers. So why are we using GAPs? They're in it to keep their customers healthy. They're in it because they really believe in providing fresh fruits and vegetables that will provide healthful nutrition to their customers. And it really protects their farm and reduces their liability. It's a part of professionalism. So as they approach you, they're able to say, we use food safe practices just as you do in your kitchens. We do the same, similar, you know, they're going to look different because our set of risks are different on farm and our scenarios are different, but we're using the same similar to HACCP, but in a farm setting. There might be regulations that pertain to these farmers. The Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, has a produce safety rule, one component of it that does apply to some farms. So you might encounter some farms that have gone through a training for the FSMA produce safety rule. Some of them might have an inspection for that. However, overall, if we have, say, maybe 3,000 fruit and vegetable farms in the state, as per our most recent ag census, only about 80 to maybe 100 of those farms are subject to that national law. Most of them are selling more direct or are smaller, so they're not. So just so you know that. A lot of our farms are a lot smaller, and I'm growing on a smaller scale than that. And then they might use good food safety to access markets, but really it does apply to all farms. So next slide. Just to be clear, it is legal and completely safe to purchase from local farms. So they don't have to have a license if they are selling product of their farm. So if this product was grown wholly by them and it doesn't include any off-farm ingredients, it is exempt from licensing. So every once in a while, something will come up where maybe a local inspector has information other than that, but you can always ask questions. We have lots of resources that can help you because licensing can get pretty complicated. But just to be clear, when it's a product of their farm, they don't have to have any sort of license for that. And they can do some basic processing as well. So this is just stating that, again, as long as there's no off-farm ingredients added, they don't have to have any sort of license or inspection for that. Next slide. A GAP audit is a voluntary food safety verification that farm could get. So if the farm is selling to a wholesale distributor, Cisco, a Bix, and many large retailers like a Walmart or a Target, some large grocery stores, especially if it's a chain, a large chain restaurant is going to require this third-party GAP audit. But the farm doesn't have to get it, but they have to get it if they want to sell to that market. So just know that if your policy is that you only would purchase from a farm with a GAP audit, that you would have many fewer farms to choose from. So maybe about 12 to 15 vegetable farms in the state do have that GAP audit because there is a price associated with it. And they're overall, now this is a generalization, but they're not selling that much wholesale. In other states, for example, a farm might sell, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of produce, and it is going primarily to wholesale operations. They absolutely would have a GAP audit because it would financially be a decision for them they would have to do that to make those sales. In our state, they might be doing some mostly farmers market. Maybe they have a CSA and then they're selling a few $1,000s to a school. Of course, there's a lot of diversity there, but in that instance, it might not be financially viable for them to pay $1,000 a year for the gap audit just for that couple $1,000 worth of product of sales to that wholesale, if that makes sense. So what we counsel farmers is to do the good practices, and they do keep some basic records, have a food safety plan, but they might not actually pay for that verification step. So we'll talk about how you can verify that perhaps without that gap audit. If it is your policy to require that gap audit, then that is okay too, but know that you will just inherently have fewer growers to choose from there. So next slide. So here are some other options. You can ask for a food safety plan. So we do have a template that we have provided to growers. It can be not very long. We're not talking about, you know, many pages. It's just going to kind of talk about their basic policies for a number of things: employee training, hand washing, their use of soil amendments. If they're using manure, that's okay, but how they reduce risk there, how they test water, how they do their best to keep animals out of the field, how they wash their surfaces or food contact surfaces, and then also how they wash their vegetables. So you can ask for the food safety plan, the test of that well water, really just talking to them. We do have guides on how to have that conversation with them. Right now they're housed on our site, but also on the Department of Ed. And so Erin is putting that in the link right now. So in the chat right now. So the Department of Ed has kind of a summary of ways to talk to your farms about food safety to guide that conversation. And then visit them if you'd like Kate said, it can be really eye-opening and very insightful and instructional for staff if you have time to do that. Next slide. So just some very brief overview of ways that farms do use good agricultural practices. Some basic things just for your knowledge. You could ask them about these things. How do they train their employees or workers or volunteers, even whoever they are, to not work when they're sick? So if you've got diarrhea, if you've got vomiting, you really shouldn't be handling fresh produce. Where's the hand washing on the farm? Where's the restrooms? Of course, it can be in the home. That's just fine. If it's got a field that's many miles away, maybe they have a porta potty and hand washing out there. The well water tested for the presence of generic E. coli that indicates fecal contamination. Generally, our wells here are quite deep and safe. Other parts of the country, they deal with a lot of surface water that's inherently a lot more risky, but our wells are pretty darn safe. But that's a kind of an insurance. It's just to say, yep, my well is protected and it's potable water. Doing their best to keep wildlife out. So some sort of fencing, but know that that's a very expensive thing and it's certainly not required to have fencing. But in general, they're training their workers to not if wildlife get in, when wildlife get in, how do we do our best to not harvest things that have visible contamination on there? Keeping pets out of the fields. If they're using manure, they're reducing the risks there, and generally applying it in the fall so that it has time to break down is the best practice. And then just keeping the tools and equipment clean. Sometimes they might have one simple log sheet that says how they've cleaned and sanitized their tools and equipment. And then if they're washing the produce, I would definitely have that conversation. As Kate said, are you washing produce? And I got another slide on produce washing, but if you're washing it in that potable water, and how is it being stored after that? Okay, so next slide. We've got a picture of a hand washing. So this is an example of what a farm might have, but it could also just be on the back of a truck. It could be on a table, or it could be a really fancy rented unit as well. But I like this version just to be clear that we are not talking about expense here. We're not talking about hundreds of dollars that farmers would have to lay out to have the hand washing. Next, okay, so rinsing. Kate mentioned it before, but you in the kitchens, of course, are rinsing all produce before consumption. But on the farm, it doesn't make sense to wash everything. So often, sometimes herbs are washed depending, but tomatoes are almost never washed on farm. Berries wouldn't be washed. Cabbage really kind of depends on the dirtiness. And then often, you know, the onions and the garlics and those kind of things would not be washed as well. Those middle categories of peppers, beans, eggplants, it really does depend on the growing conditions, and the farmers will know this. Do they get dirty? If there's visible soil, yes, you'll likely request for them to remove that visible soil prior to delivery. But I would talk about how much is acceptable, because sometimes it might just be dust. And that might be perfectly okay that you can then rinse off. So just kind of having that discussion about how much is too much. Maybe they could even send you a photo and say, gosh, it rained. When it rains, if they're not growing on plastic, it can have some splash up. So then you could say, you know, these have gotten dirty. Should we wash these? Certainly root crops and most greens are likely going to be washed because they just are dirty enough. That the farmers would do that on the farm. So we've got a spray table here. That's a really nice way to spray off roots. That's an example of kind of a table that many farms would have. And then we've got the bulk tank on the right. That's just a tote. That's how often farms are washing things on farm. So I would just kind of have that conversation and say, how are you washing things? First of all, is it going to be washed? And second of all, how are you washing those? So they're just changing that water frequently. But then you should always wash it again once it gets in there. It's just kind of like a first pass. So we're not getting too much soil in the drains in the kitchen. Any questions, or should we wait till the end? Either one is just fine with me.
You can wait till the end. Does that make sense? Okay.
Sounds good.
Well, thank you, Annalisa. And so now we're going to transition over to Rae Rusnak from L&R Poultry and Produce to share a little bit about Rae's perspective as a farmer working with schools to sell produce. So I will pass it to you, Rae. And if you're talking, Rae, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right. I'm going to talk to you first today about finding us farmers. And I really hope as part of your new beginning into farm to school, if you are new, that you will find a farm that's close to you, where you will get to see the farmer's face. You might get to visit the farm, and you might be able to have the farmer join you in a classroom or in a lunchroom to meet the school kids, because that, I think, is one of the great benefits of farm to school for both the farmers and the schools. Farmers, in this list that I put together here, these are mostly things that are not necessarily government agencies. I know that Kate and Annalisa and a lot of you people at U of M Extension, Department of Agriculture, Education, Health, and so on, you have a lot of lists and a ton of information online for anybody that wants to buy local produce to think about. So I tried to put together in my list maybe some things that wouldn't be in your list. Food co-ops and grocery stores, if you have a small grocery store or you have a food co-op in your area, they are probably already buying from produce farmers in your area. So they would be a great place to start. I'm sure any produce manager or store manager would be happy to talk about who they buy from and what products are available. And probably give you contact information for those farmers or where to look for them. So that's a great place to start. I also want to let you know that there are a number of independent farms. Many farms are big enough to grow and pack and deliver directly to you. A lot of us list on Minnesota Grown through their wholesale directory. Many of us maintain farm websites or other social media that you can find online. There are a lot of farm events that happen around the state, things as big as like the Garlic Festival and things as small as your local farmers market. There are meet and greets going on all the time for various things. I just attended one earlier this winter that was farm to school related. I got to meet some of you new grantees that are going to be starting your programs. So those are great ways to find farmers. Anybody that you can ask who you think has some connection to buying local food would be a great source. Farm organizations, I would say that most farmers belong to some group, and the list of groups is huge. I've listed a few here. SFA, the Sustainable Farming Association of Minnesota, they have local chapters. And so there's likely that one of the local chapters encompasses your school district. And they very often promote their farmers or have a website where they showcase their farmers, give contact information and product information. Land stewardship project, there we go. They also are a big one that many farmers belong to. I know they have lists for people who are interested in finding CSAs and other types of ways to buy directly from farmers. Minnesota Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association is a big one. They hold an annual conference. A lot of the big growers are members of that organization. And then there are product-oriented groups such as the Minnesota Maple Syrup Producers Association. They maintain a website of all their producers and who sells to the public, who allows visits. Pastured Poultry Association, Minnesota Pork Producers, Apple Producers. Cannon Valley Grown is one in my area that I belong to. It's a special group formed by many of us who are members of the Cannon Valley chapter of the Sustainable Farming Association. And we've gotten together because there are a lot of us who share the Cannon River watershed in common. And we wanted to showcase the many things that are grown in our area. We have some great soils here, and you can get just about any agricultural product you want. Farmers market hubs are, I think, a new and exciting thing. They are their information is being disseminated through the Minnesota Farmers Market Association, which has a big online presence, and also Renewing the Countryside, who helped with some of the funding of the project. If you live in an area near one of these farmers market hubs, which is basically a farmers market that already existed, but is taking the extra steps to put the infrastructure in place to take orders from buyers, including schools, and put together produce from the farmers in their group and that come to their market and disseminate the produce from there. So it's another way to reach small farms. And then finally, the aggregators, they represent many farms. There's lots of them. There's the Hmong American Farmers Association and the Good Acre, and many of them are willing to sell directly to you as well. Next slide. And these are just some, I think, things that you could do right from home without knowing anybody. Advertise yourself. Get on your website, put your name, let people know that your school is buying local produce, that you want to participate in farm to school, or you already are. Make it easy to know who the farmer should talk to, specifically what person. So get that out there. Also, if there are other districts in your area that you know already have farm to school programs, I'm sure they'd be willing to share some of the farmers that they've worked with. I've worked with Minneapolis Farm to School for many years, and they have a website loaded with information about working with farmers. And also, I think a lot of farmers are aware of this grant that has been put out to a lot of you to get your farm to school program up and running. So they're eager to meet you, they know about you, and they want to grow for you. So if somebody reaches out to you, follow up with them. A lot of farmers may not have what you want, but they might want to grow it for you. That is certainly something I've done. And they probably know other farmers that have what you might need as well. Next slide. When you build your relationship, communication is number one. When you're new as a farmer or a school, to farm to school, you don't think the same about produce. Farmers are used to selling directly to the customer, farmers market, CSA, off their farm, and they know they grow it and here it is and it looks good, but they aren't worried about if it's 3 ounces or 5 ounces or what kind of box it's in, that sort of thing. A school, you're probably used to working with a distributor who has hundreds of pounds of produce available most of the time, a big variety of it, and you have it all season long, whether it's locally seasonal or not. So that's going to be different when you work with farm to school. So it's really important that you, the school and the farmer, are really clear about the timing of crops, which changes every year, unfortunately, with our weather patterns. So that's a big one there. And also all the things that Kate and Annalisa talked about with packaging, menuing, and so on. But the benefits are great. You're going to get better tasting, much more nutritious, beautiful produce. And but as long as you know, you're going to have to learn about one another, things will go well. Next slide. Okay, no questions dumb. I always say that when I got into farm to school, me and the school people had no idea what the other one didn't know. Okay, so ask. There is no dumb question. Crop updates and menu updates are huge. I talk about crop progress and menuing as kind of having to evolve together throughout the season. And if you can make a regular time for checking in with your farmer or getting your farmer to check in with you about how that crop is progressing, that's really going to help, and how much flexibility you might have in your menuing. If you can communicate that to the farmer, that would be great too. So it's a two-way progress reporting, but it's really important, and start that communication early in the season. And next slide. Answer all your communications quickly. You know, sometimes on the farm, or if somebody's trying to put together a menu and they're panicking and they haven't heard from you, do you have 1,000 pounds? Do you have 800 pounds? What do you have? You gotta get that information out there quickly. So I say that's a big one. And crop progress is huge. Also, it's huge when it's in storage. It's not just when it's growing, but when it's in storage too, because things can happen in storage. Sometimes things don't hold the way we think they're gonna, or they hold longer. So you need to know that. And hopefully with the crop progress and the menuing going on together, they can figure out a way to utilize the crop when it's ready. It's hard when it's later or earlier than usual, but that's a big one. And so don't underestimate that. That's a really big one. And then lastly, photos are great. I've sent a lot of photos to schools I've worked with, to the processor, to produce managers I work with. If there's any question about if something looks right, or is big enough, or if the packing's right, a picture says it all right there. So if you're not sure if the farmer is telling you about something, the way it looks or how ready it is, ask for a photo. And I hope you have a good season, and I hope you meet some good farmers, and I hope the kids get as excited as we do about growing and sharing our produce. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rae. Those were all great points. And I especially love the photo one at the end, and just, I want to remember that for when I'm talking to different folks, but I think that's a great tool to have to really make communication extra clear. So finally, we're going to hear from Erica at Wayzata Public Schools on kind of their approach for buying local produce. So I'll pass it to you, Erica.
Awesome, thank you. All right, you can go to the next slide. Thanks, Kate. Well, actually, Rae ended up covering a whole bunch of the things I'm going to talk about. So for the sake of time, I'll try to keep things kind of brief. I can usually talk forever about farm to school because it's one of my absolute passions. But so I previously worked at Hopkins, where we had a pretty established farm to school program. And here at Wayzata, we are just kind of starting out. Like I said, this is our first year doing the farm to school grant work. So we're very excited to dig in and make connections. So here's some of the things that we think about when we've been working on our big lists of what to buy is, some of those simple things like kids' favorites. What are the things that kids are just, it's going to be a slam dunk, what are they going to eat? And so we know they're going to want to have things that are sweet and familiar, the carrots, the delicata squash, those types of things, just because it's a lot of work that our staff put into preparing these types of things. And so we definitely want to see them going in the bellies instead of in the trash. We're also working on menu items. And so for instance, we're roasting tomatoes to make homemade roasted tomato sauce. And that way we can also preserve it for throughout the year. And so we can feature it like in the fall with cheese bread, in the winter with pasta, in the spring with another item. So you can kind of carry that farm to school throughout the whole school year, which is kind of fun. We're also love doing taste testing, so getting some different fruits and vegetables out there too that kids have that they're not familiar with. This fall, for instance, we had black radishes that were just awesome, and they happened to be out right at Halloween, so they were pure black on the outside and then white on the inside. And so we put up fun signage too to kind of see, you know, we dare you to eat the radishes on the line. So that was kind of fun. And then also this fall, just the planning is huge, and like Rae was talking about, you know, crops can be fast, they can be slow, they can be right on time, we never know. So just kind of getting a baseline for us, we've been using the harvest of the month calendar just to be able to give our farmers and producers an idea of the items that we're going to be looking for. So like I was saying, the sweet stuff, one of the questions that Kate gave me was, what produce have you had the most success with? I would say both here and at Hopkins, the delicata squash just goes over really, really well. It's easy to process either by hand or through a RoboCoo. But it's fun to hear because the schools, the kids will come in and the staff will come in and be like, oh, are you baking pie? Because we use either pumpkin pie spice or even just some cinnamon and salt on it. And so it really kind of helps sell that product by having that wonderful smell all throughout the school. As most of you probably know too, rather than trying to do a butternut or something that we're going to have to peel and process a little bit further, you can roast it with the skin on and the whole thing is edible. So, and I have on the bottom there too, it's easy to coach because we often use the sentence, would you like a little or a lot of fill in the blank? And so that kids kind of just have two options. Like, am I going to have a little broccoli today, or am I going to have a lot of broccoli today? And so it's a good one to get kids to take in the lunch on. The biggest challenge is that darn weather. I'm sure for those of you that, you know, grow tomatoes and those types of things, we had an interesting season last year. You know, we thought we were like gonna have all these tomatoes and here they all come, and then I think it cooled off, if I remember correctly, for a couple of weeks, and so it really slowed things down. We also can have weather disruptions, you know, just too wet to be out in the field, those types of things, too cold to ripen. And so I know we've had well, of course my battery's running low, you guys, so hang on for 1 second. Sorry about that. We were supposed to get some delicata in actually last fall, and so our shipment was delayed for one of those types of reasons. And so we just have to be flexible with producers and growers. And so we were offered carrots, rainbow carrots, in place of that, and so we just took those instead. So that is kind of my, I think there was a couple other slides. Did we miss one about, had a bunch of little symbols on it? I don't have it open in front of me either, otherwise I would read it off to you. Let me see. Maybe I have a questions here. Oh, I know. It was talking about how to find farmers. So for me, I have a number of just relationships that have been established with local farmers. And so for instance, this year I was wondering like, oh, where can we get apples and pears from? And so Riverbend Farms Farmer Greg is wonderful to work with. And so I just reached out to him and said, hey, you know, we're going to be looking for a pretty large amount of apples and pears. Where would you recommend for us to go? So that's kind of a nice way of doing it. Also, I frequent the Maple Grove Farmers Market, and so I'll just go through there and strike up conversations with the different producers there and say, hey, you know what, I work for a school district. Would you ever be interested in providing produce to our program there as well? And I think the other slide was all about communication, but Rae really covered that. I'm finding that every farmer has a little bit different style of conversation. Like Moses with Kilimo, he likes to do Zoom calls, which is fantastic. We get to actually talk and see each other's faces and stuff when we're chatting. We do a lot of email and a lot of phone calls, but I do also agree that pretty consistent communication has been very important, especially with those crop updates. I was just thinking that was a really good bit of information. And that also too, just a plug for the farmers, as most of you guys know, they're wanting to know numbers now. And so I spent the morning on the phone and doing email with like Hafa and a couple other different farms and growers. And so they are really kind of pushing like, hey, we need to know what you're looking for in the fall, because they are putting those seeds in right now. So if you can get in contact, the sooner the better, they'd really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Erica. I'm sorry that slides was missing. Oh, we have your video.
Oh, yes. So this is my son, and he is crying because he didn't get enough delicata squash.
How many do you have? How many squash do you need? I think he has 5.
I love it. Wanting more squash. That's like the dream come true, right? Awesome. Well, with that, I know we're just about out of time. So okay, there we go. I think a few very high level takeaways is like invest in relationships, frequent and open communications. I also want to say I love Rae's thing that like there's no dumb question. And you know, I know with like hopefully a lot of this information is helpful for you to be able to go back and kind of think through. But also if you don't know something, that's totally okay. And I think that also this is something you learn a little bit more each year. And so if you're just starting out, it's okay to start, you know, small, recognizing that there's going to be growth for everyone involved and you get to learn together in a partnership, which is what makes it all the better. So, and then be flexible and be willing to try new things and learn new things. So with that, I think, you know, we'll send out these slides and the resources. We have more webinars coming up that we'll also send in our follow-up email. But maybe I'll just see, Erin, are there any questions that we did receive that we want to try to answer quick?
I did just see one question to Erica about whether you're willing to share some of your recipes that and menus that you've developed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just put my email in the chat. So if anybody wants to connect that way, but then certainly we could have a phone call. I'm happy to help.
Great. We didn't get a ton of questions during the presentations. I think everyone was raptly paying attention to all of our expert presenters today. As Kate said, we do have a few more webinars scheduled coming up. So when we send out the follow-up email, we'll include the registration links for those, but they are specific like this one on certain topics. So we have one on buying local meat, and one on local foods around the tray. So not produce, not meat, but other local items that you can get. And then we also have one coming up that's more for the audience of farms and food hubs and distribution companies that are working with schools to help them understand things from the other side. So please share with your partners, and you can register for those when we send the follow-up email. But otherwise, I just want to thank our wonderful presenters today. That was such rich information, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to come. And we will resume our interactive office hours where you can ask your questions and we'll give you hands-on advice next month. So we'll share the registration for that as well. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us, and we're looking forward to another great year of Farm to School coming up here. Have a great day, everybody.
Yay.